A woman kneels in the dark beside something enormous and dying. Wind moves through dry grass at 2 in the morning, and somewhere past the fence line, a town sleeps without knowing that its most beloved animal has collapsed 100 yards from a stranger's porch light. The woman does not call for help. She does not run for a phone. She presses her palm flat against a heaving ribcage and stays exactly where she is, because she already knows what will happen if anyone else finds him first. By sunrise, 150 men on horseback will surround her barn demanding she open the doors. She will not. Before we go back to the beginning of that night, here is what you need to know. The horse in that barn is not just any horse. He has opened every rodeo parade in that Wyoming town for 11 straight years, carried flags down Main Street on the 4th of July, and stood so still for children's photographs that grandmothers cried. Everyone in that county believes they know him. Almost none of them have noticed he has been dying slowly in front of them for months. If you've ever lived in a small town where an animal becomes bigger than the people who claim to love it, you already understand what's coming. Comment the name of your state or your country below, because this one hits different depending on where you grew up. If stories like this matter to you, hit like, subscribe, and stay until the end, because what the veterinarian finds inside that barn changes everything this town believed about the horse, the woman, and itself. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The town of Larkspur Hollow sits low in a bowl of dry hills, the kind of place where the wind never quite stops and the grass turns the color of old rope by late July. It is a town built around horses the way other towns are built around rivers or railroads. The rodeo grounds sit at its center, the arena fence painted white every spring whether it needs it or not, and the annual Founders Day parade is spoken about with the same reverence other places reserve for church. 6 miles outside of town, past a cattle guard that rattles under any vehicle heavier than a bicycle, sits 60 acres of hay ground that used to be worth bragging about. The barn is red once and gray now. The house beside it has curtains that are always drawn, even at noon, even in August when the heat presses against the glass like something trying to get in. Bernice Colton is 52 years old, and the town has mostly stopped trying to guess what she does out there. She was not always like this. There are people in Larkspur Hollow old enough to remember when she used to bring pie to the county fair, when her husband Wade ran the baler and she ran the books, when the two of them sat in the third row at every rodeo like it was reserved. Wade Colton died 6 years ago on a Tuesday in October, standing in the hay barn with a pitchfork still in his hand, his heart stopping so suddenly that the coroner told Bernice there had likely been no pain, as if that detail was meant to comfort her. What nobody in town knew, because Bernice never told them, was that Wade had complained of chest tightness for 11 months before that Tuesday. He had waved it off as heartburn. She had let him wave it off, because the hay needed cutting and the bills needed paying, and neither of them had time to sit in a waiting room in the county seat over something that was probably nothing. It was not nothing. Since then, Bernice has run the hay operation alone, selling round bales to ranchers who no longer ask after her health, buying groceries in the next town over so she does not have to make conversation at the register, and keeping the radio off in the truck because the silence, unbearable as it sometimes is, at least belongs to her. The barn is the one place she still talks out loud, usually to no one. Sometimes to the two old geldings she keeps more out of habit than need. She has learned to listen for things other people miss. A shift in a horse's weight, a held breath, the particular quiet an animal makes right before something goes wrong. She has learned this the hard way, on a man instead of a horse, and she has never once said this out loud to another living soul. Larkspur Hollow, for its part, has decided she is simply the widow who keeps to herself now. Grief does strange things to strange people, they say, without much unkindness, and mostly without much thought at all. None of them know that 6 miles outside their painted white fences, a woman who once failed to hear a warning is about to hear one so clearly it will pull her out of bed in the middle of the night. None of them know that the thing she is about to protect is the one thing the entire town has agreed, without ever discussing it, that it cannot afford to lose. The wind picks up an hour before midnight. Bernice is still awake, the way she often is, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold, when her dog Scout begins to whine at the back door in a tone she has heard only twice before in her life, and both times it meant something in the dark had already gone badly wrong. Scout does not bark. He scratches, low and insistent, at the door facing the north pasture, the one that borders the county road, and, beyond that, for miles of open range that belongs to nobody and everybody. Bernice stands without deciding to stand. The way a body sometimes moves faster than the mind gives it permission to. She takes the flashlight from the hook by the door, not the porch light, because some old instinct in her prefers not to announce herself to whatever is out there. The night air outside is dry and cold in the way high desert nights are. The sky so clear it looks freshly washed, and for a moment there is nothing but the sound of her own boots on gravel and Scout's low, worried breathing beside her leg. Then she hears it, a sound like a sack of grain dropped from a height, followed by a long, ragged exhale that is unmistakably alive. The beam of her flashlight finds him at the fence line, half sunk into the shallow ditch that runs along the property boundary, a shape so much larger than anything that should be lying down at that hour that for a full 3 seconds Bernice does not move at all. He is enormous. Even collapsed, even trembling, there is a bearing to him, an old-fashioned grandness in the set of his neck and the depth of his chest, the kind of horse built 2 generations ago before breeding trends shrank everything down to sport-sized. His coat is a deep bay-gone gray at the muzzle, and across his left hip, faded but still legible in the flashlight beam, is a brand Bernice recognizes immediately, because everyone within 50 miles recognizes it. It is the Larkspur Hollow Rodeo Association brand. The same brand stitched onto the parade banner every July. The same horse, she understands now with a slow, cold certainty, that carried the flag down Main Street just 11 days ago at the pre-festival exhibition, striding so proudly that a photograph of him made the front page of the county paper. His name is Major, and Major is not supposed to be lying in a ditch on Bernice Colton's property at midnight, for miles from the fairgrounds where he is stabled, 12 hours before he is scheduled to lead the biggest parade of the year. Bernice climbs through the fence wire without hurrying, though everything in her wants to hurry, because she has learned that hurrying around something frightened only makes the fright worse. She crouches low, out of his eye line, and speaks in a voice barely above breath, the kind of voice she has not used on a living thing in longer than she can remember. Major's ribs rise and fall too fast. His neck stretches long and flat along the ground in a posture no healthy horse holds by choice. Sweat has dried into pale, salted lines along his flanks despite the cold night, and when Bernice finally lays a hand on his shoulder, the muscle beneath the skin twitches like something trying to escape from the inside. She does not call the sheriff. She does not call the fairgrounds. She does not call Merton Ashby, president of the Larkspur Hollow Cattlemen and Horse Owners Association, whose number is still written on a card tacked to her kitchen wall from Wade's memorial service 6 years ago, under the heading "In case you ever need anything." She knows exactly what would happen if she made any of those calls. A truck and trailer would arrive within the hour. Men with good intentions and worse judgment would haul Major to his feet, load him under bright lights, and by 9 in the morning he would be standing in the arena in full parade tack, carrying the flag because that is what Major does, because that is who Major is. Because 11 years of doing something does not leave room in anyone's mind for the possibility that this year might be the year his heart cannot do it anymore. Instead, Bernice does something that will take a very long time for anyone in Larkspur Hollow to understand. She goes back to the barn, opens the wide double doors at the north end, the ones that swing without a sound because she oiled the hinges herself last spring, and returns to Major's side with a lead rope she does not remember carrying with her, though she must have, because it is in her hand. She does not force him up. She waits, kneeling in the dirt beside a horse 3 times her weight, until his breathing settles into something almost even, and only then does she begin the slow work of coaxing him to his feet, one shift of weight at a time, her voice low and constant, the same 3 or 4 words repeated so quietly that even Scout, sitting a few feet away, cannot make them out. It takes almost 40 minutes. When Major finally stands, swaying, his head hanging low enough that his nose nearly brushes the ground, Bernice does not celebrate. She simply turns and walks, slow enough that an old and exhausted horse can follow, toward the open doors of a barn that has not sheltered anything more significant than 2 aging geldings in 6 years. By the time the 2 of them are inside and the doors are shut behind them, the fairgrounds 4 miles away are still lit up with generator lights and rehearsal noise, still entirely unaware that the horse scheduled to lead tomorrow's parade is no longer in his stall. Inside the barn, Bernice does not turn on the overhead lights. She lights the single lantern hanging near the tack room instead, low and amber, because bright light on an animal this spent feels, to her, like an assault. She works quickly and without ceremony, pulling 2 heavy wool blankets from a trunk she has not opened since Wade's funeral, layering them over Major's back and chest while he stands with his legs splayed slightly for balance. Head still low, eyes half closed. She checks his gums, presses a thumb against the tissue, and counts the seconds it takes the color to return, a habit left over from decades of ranch life. The color is slow to come back. Too slow. She checks the pulse at his jaw next, and her hand goes still there far longer than the check requires, because whatever she is counting does not match anything she wants it to match. She does not know, not with certainty, what is wrong with him. She knows only what 30 years around horses has taught her to recognize, which is the specific, bone-deep exhaustion of an animal that has been asked to give more than it is left to give, for longer than anyone bothered to notice. At some point past 1 in the morning, she sits down in the straw beside him, back against a support post, and does not move again until dawn. It is nearly 6 when the first sound of trouble reaches her, carried faint and strange across the flat morning air. A generator cutting off in the distance. Voices raised, then more voices, then the unmistakable, rising commotion of a crowd realizing something has gone badly wrong before it was supposed to go right. Bernice does not need to guess what has happened. Someone at the fairgrounds has gone to fetch Major for his morning grooming, expecting to find 1,100 pounds of dependable, docile horseflesh standing exactly where he always stands, and has instead found an empty stall, a broken section of pipe fencing at its rear corner, and hoofprints leading off into open range in the dark. By 6:30, the story has already begun to spread the way stories spread in towns small enough that everyone is only one phone call removed from everyone else. Major is missing. Major, symbol of the town, star of 11 parades, is gone the morning of the festival's biggest day, and every man who owns a saddle and a truck feels, suddenly, that finding him is a personal obligation. Bernice hears the first engines on the county road a little after 7. She does not go to the window. She sits in the barn with her hand resting on Major's shoulder, feeling the rise and fall of his breath finally settle into something closer to rest, and understands, with the particular dread of someone who has made a decision she is not yet ready to defend, that the search parties will follow tracks the same way she once followed the sound of her husband's breathing without ever really hearing what it was trying to tell her. The tracks lead in one direction only. Off the fairgrounds, across open range, straight toward the boundary fence of a hay farm belonging to the widow nobody in town has spoken more than 10 words to in 6 years. By 8 in the morning, the first riders crest the low hill above Bernice Colton's property, and what they see stops them cold. Every barn door on the place is shut and barred from the inside. Every window in the house has its curtains drawn exactly as they always are, and planted at the edge of the porch, arms crossed, feet set wide apart like she has been standing there for hours and intends to stand there for many more, is Bernice herself, watching them arrive without a flicker of surprise. She has been expecting them since the moment she heard the first far-off shout at the fairgrounds. What she did not expect, not fully, not until this exact moment, is how many of them there would be, or how quickly the number would grow, rider by rider, truck by truck, until by 9 o'clock the road above her property is lined with more horses and men than Larkspur Hollow has assembled for anything since the founding day centennial. The first rider to reach the fence line is not Merton Ashby. It is a younger man, wiry and anxious, one of the fairground hands responsible for Major's care, and the accusation leaves his mouth before he has even swung down from his saddle. She stole him, he says, loud enough for the men behind him to hear. She stole the horse. Bernice does not answer. She simply turns, walks back up the porch steps, and goes inside, leaving the young man shouting after her into an empty yard, and leaving 150 riders behind him to decide, on their own, what that silence is supposed to mean. Word travels through a gathered crowd the way fire travels through dry grass, fast, and without needing much fuel. By 9:30, the number of horses and trucks parked along the county road outside Bernice Colton's fence line has grown past anything that could reasonably be called a search party. It is closer to a gathering, the kind of crowd that forms not because everyone has a reason to be there, but because nobody wants to be the one who wasn't. Merton Ashby arrives at 9:45, and the crowd shifts around him the way it shifts around anyone whose presence changes the temperature of a room. He is 61 years old, built like a man who has spent his whole life lifting things heavier than himself, and he has known Bernice Colton since before either of them had gray in their hair. He was a pallbearer at Wade's funeral. He has not spoken more than a passing word to Bernice since. He does not shout. He does not need to. He dismounts at the gate, hands his reins to the nearest rider without looking to see who takes them, and walks the length of the drive alone, boots raising small clouds of dust with every step, while behind him 150 riders sit their horses and wait to see what happens next. Bernice is already on the porch when he reaches the steps. She has not moved from that spot in nearly 2 hours, and there is a stillness to her that unsettles him more than shouting would have, because he remembers, distantly, that Wade used to go quiet in exactly this way in the last months before he died, and nobody in town thought anything of that either. Merton stops at the bottom step. He does not climb it. "Bernice," he says, and lets the name sit there a moment before continuing. "Everybody up that road thinks you took something that isn't yours to take." She does not answer right away. Her eyes move once, briefly, to the barn behind her and back to him, and the silence stretches long enough that a lesser man might have filled it. Merton does not fill it. He waits, the way he has learned to wait with skittish stock, though it does not occur to him yet that he is doing the same thing to her that a herd does to a wounded animal, closing in slowly, testing for weakness. "That horse is due in the arena in 4 hours, he says finally. "There are families driving in from 3 counties to watch him lead that parade. There's a plaque with his name on it going up outside the grandstand this afternoon. You understand what you're doing to this town." Still Bernice says nothing. Her hand, resting on the porch rail, does not tremble, but her knuckles have gone pale from the grip. Merton's jaw tightens. Something in her stillness reads to him not as calm, but as defiance. And defiance from a woman who has spent 6 years making herself invisible strikes him as its own kind of wrongness, a thing that needs correcting before it spreads. "You open that barn," he says, voice lower now, almost gentle, almost a warning between old friends. "You open it now, and we forget this happened. You don't, and I can't promise what the sheriff makes of it, or what this does to your name or to Wade's. He built half the fence on these fairgrounds with his own hands. You want people remembering him for this instead of that. It is the first time in 6 years anyone has spoken Wade's name to Bernice as a threat, and something in her face changes, so briefly that only a man who has known her 30 years would catch it at all. Merton catches it. He does not know what he is looking at, only that it costs her something, and for one uncertain second, he wonders if he has gone too far. Then Bernice speaks, and her voice, when it comes, is steady in a way that surprises them both. "Nobody is opening that door until he's ready to walk out of it on his own legs," she says. "Not you, not the sheriff, not 150 men on horses." Behind Merton, a murmur moves through the gathered riders, low and uneasy, the sound of a crowd recalculating what kind of morning this is going to be. Somewhere near the back, a man's voice rises loud enough to carry. "She's lost her mind out here alone," he says, not quite to anyone, and not quite to himself either. Bernice hears it. She does not react to it. She turns instead, walks back through her own front door, and closes it, and the sound of the latch falling into place is somehow louder than anything the crowd has said all morning. Merton stands alone at the base of the steps for a long moment, staring at a closed door he has known, in one form or another, for 30 years, and behind him 150 riders begin, in low voices and long silences, deciding among themselves how much longer they intend to wait before they stop waiting at all. The morning stretches on that way for over an hour, the crowd along the fence line neither growing nor thinning, simply holding, the way weather holds before it decides which direction to break. Somebody produces binoculars and studies the barn's high window for any sign of movement inside, finding none. Somebody else walks the fence line twice, as if a second look might reveal an entrance nobody noticed the first time. A few of the older riders, men who knew Wade Colton personally, sit their horses at a slight remove from the rest, saying little, watching the house with an expression closer to discomfort than anger, as though some part of them already suspects there is more to this morning than a stubborn woman and a missing horse. One of them, a rancher named Otis who farmed the section adjoining Bernice's land for over 20 years, finally speaks what a few others have clearly been thinking and not saying. She's not the type to do something for no reason, he says, to nobody in particular. Whatever else you want to say about her, Bernice Colton was never reckless a day in her life. Nobody answers him directly, but the comment settles over a portion of the crowd the way a single dropped stone settles into still water, spreading outward in small, quiet ripples of doubt. It does not change anyone's position. It does not open the barn door. But it plants, in at least a few of the riders gathered along that fence, the first small seed of a question that will grow louder as the morning wears on. Not whether Bernice has done something wrong, but whether the town has been too quick, for 6 long years, to decide who she is without ever once asking her. Merton feels that shift too, standing at the gate with his hat still in his hand, though he does not yet have words for it. He only knows that something about the silence behind that door has begun to weigh on him differently than it did an hour ago, less like defiance and more like a warning he has not yet learned how to read. By 11 o'clock, the crowd along the county road has thickened into something with its own restless weather. Trucks idle with radios murmuring low, horses shift and stamp, unsettled by standing too long in one place, the way animals often absorb the tension of the humans holding their leads. Someone has produced a folding table and a thermos of coffee, as though this has become an event in its own right, separate now from the parade it was meant to protect. Merton has not moved far from the gate. He paces the width of it, hat off, running a hand through hair gone thin and gray, replaying the closed door in his mind the way a man replays a hand of cards he is certain he misplayed, but cannot say how. It is a boy of 19, one of the fairground stable hands named Ezra, who breaks the standoff without meaning to. Ezra has spent the last 2 hours at the edge of the crowd, quieter than the men around him, his young face carrying the particular guilt of someone who suspects he knows something nobody has asked him yet. When Merton finally notices him standing apart, arms folded tight across his chest, he calls the boy over with nothing more than a jerk of his chin. Ezra does not want to say what he says next. It shows in the way he shifts his weight before he speaks, in the way his eyes go to the ground and stay there. Major's been off for a while, he says. Not lame, just off, slower coming out of his stall, sweating heavier than he should for the work we've had him doing. Merton's expression does not change, but something behind it does. How long, Merton says. Since spring, maybe, Ezra says. Doc Holbrook's been out twice. Gave him something for his joints. Told the committee he needed lighter duty going into festival season. The silence that follows is different from every silence that has come before it that morning. It is not tense. It is heavy, in the way a fact becomes heavy the moment it can no longer be unknown. And the committee, Merton says slowly, kept him in the parade lineup anyway. Ezra does not answer that directly. He does not have to. His silence answers for him. And Merton, standing in the dust with a boy half his age refusing to meet his eyes, feels the first cold edge of something he has not yet let himself name. Word of the conversation does not stay contained to the two of them. It moves through the crowd the way all things move through a crowd that has nothing left to do but talk, past rider to rider, growing sharper edges with each retelling, until what began as Ezra's quiet, guilty confession has become an open question hanging over the entire gathering. What, exactly, has the festival committee known, and for how long? And why has an old horse been carrying a flag down Main Street every summer instead of resting in a pasture the way an animal his age should be? Allowed to. Nobody says out loud yet that Bernice might have known something the rest of them didn't. Nobody says it, but more than a few faces in that crowd begin, slowly, to turn toward the closed barn behind her house with something other than certainty. Merton stands at the gate a long while after Ezra walks away, hat still in his hand, staring at the same closed door Bernice shut an hour earlier. And for the first time since he rode onto the property that morning, the question forming behind his eyes is no longer what has she done. It is what does she know that we don't. By noon, Larkspur Hollow itself has begun arriving at Bernice Colton's fence line. Not just the riders who set out at dawn, but the town proper. The ones who drive out in sedans and minivans once word spreads far enough to reach Main Street. The festival committee chairwoman, a sharp, harried woman named Doreen Fitch, arrives with a folder of paperwork under one arm and the look of someone already rehearsing what she will say to the county newspaper. The crowd outside the fence has swelled past 200 now, counting the ones on foot, and the mood among them has fractured into competing currents. Some are furious at Bernice, certain that whatever her reasons, she has no right to hold a piece of the town's shared heritage hostage. Others, having heard Ezra's confession secondhand and thirdhand, have begun murmuring about anti-inflammatories and lighter duty and how long. Exactly, has anybody actually looked at that horse instead of just looking at him? Doreen Fitch does not wait for permission. She marches to the gate, folder in hand, and demands to know from Merton why the sheriff has not yet been called to force the issue. Because, Merton says, and the words come out slower than he intends, because I don't think forcing it is going to end the way you think it's going to end. Doreen's expression tightens. She has spent 11 years building the festival into what it is, has spent this particular year fighting for a larger parade budget, larger crowds, larger coverage from papers 2 counties over, and the idea that the parade's centerpiece might simply not appear this afternoon is, to her, not a possibility to be considered. It is a crisis to be solved. Get the sheriff, she says. Get the vet. Get whatever it takes. That horse is not missing the parade. It is at this point that Grant Holbrook, the town's veterinarian for the better part of 2 decades, arrives in his truck, summoned not by Doreen, but by Merton himself, quietly, on a call made 20 minutes earlier that Merton has not yet told anyone else about. Grant is a heavy-set man in his 60s with the unhurried manner of someone who has delivered enough foals in enough bad weather to no longer be rattled by crowds or shouting. He steps out of his truck, takes in the scene, the parked trucks, the restless horses, the closed barn, the woman still visible through her kitchen window, and asks Merton a single question before doing anything else. Has anyone actually laid eyes on the horse since he went missing? Grant says. Merton admits that no one has. Not officially. Not since the tracks led here. Then before anybody talks about sheriffs, Grant says, somebody needs to let me see him. Because if half of what Ezra is saying about those joint injections is true, that horse walking 4 miles in the dark on his own legs isn't the story that worries me. The crowd nearest the gate goes quiet enough to hear the words clearly, and the quiet spreads outward in a slow ripple, the way understanding sometimes moves through a crowd faster than any announcement could carry it. Doreen opens her mouth to argue and finds, for perhaps the first time in her 11 years running the festival, that she does not have an argument ready. Merton turns from her, walks back to the gate, and this time, when he calls Bernice's name toward the closed farmhouse door, his voice carries none of the warning it held that morning. It carries something closer to a request. Bernice, he says, I've got Doc Holbrook here. Just him. Nobody else. Let him look at the horse. For a long moment, nothing happens. The crowd behind Merton holds its collective breath, horses shifting, engines idling. More than 200 people waiting on the decision of one woman standing behind a curtain none of them can see past. Then the front door opens. Bernice steps onto the porch alone, and the crowd's attention narrows onto her the way light narrows through a lens. Every face along that fence line turned toward a woman who has not addressed more than a handful of words to any of them in 6 years. She does not look at the crowd. She looks at Merton, and past him, briefly, at Grant Holbrook standing beside his truck with his black bag already in hand, and something in the set of her shoulders shifts, not toward surrender, but toward a decision she has clearly been carrying alone since well before dawn. Just him, she says. Nobody else sets foot past that fence. Doreen Fitch starts forward immediately, folder raised like a badge of authority, insisting that as festival chair she has every right to inspect town property, and it is Merton, not Bernice, who stops her with a raised hand and a look that ends the argument before it can properly begin. Grant walks the length of the drive alone, black bag in one hand, and Bernice meets him at the base of the porch steps rather than waiting for him to climb them. Up close, out of the crowd's hearing, something in her posture loosens slightly, the particular relief of a person who has been holding something heavy entirely by herself and is about to, for the first time in 12 hours, share the weight of it. He's inside, she says, low enough that only Grant hears it. He went down at the fence line around midnight. I didn't move him until I knew he could stand under his own power. He's been resting since. Grant's expression does not change, but his eyes sharpen in the particular way of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the morning. You didn't call anyone, he says. Not the fairgrounds. Not the sheriff. If I'd called the fairgrounds, Bernice says, they'd have had him tacked up and standing in that arena by 8 o'clock this morning. And you and I both know what a full morning of parade work does to a heart that's already struggling to keep up with a body 20 years past its prime. Grant does not answer that immediately. He looks toward the barn, toward the closed doors, and something passes behind his eyes that looks almost like recognition. The look of a man who has spent months documenting small, worrying signs in his professional notes and quietly hoping he was wrong about what they meant. Merton, watching from the gate, cannot hear the exchange, only see it. And something about the way Grant's posture changes, the way his hand comes to rest briefly on Bernice's shoulder before he continues toward the barn alone, tells Merton this conversation has just become something far more serious than a stolen horse. The wait that follows is the longest of the morning. Grant is inside the barn for nearly 20 minutes. The doors shut behind him, while outside the crowd grows louder with speculation, and Doreen Fitch grows louder still with demands that someone, anyone, tell her what is happening on the other side of that fence. Bernice remains on the porch the entire time, arms wrapped around herself now in a way she has not allowed anyone to see all morning, and Merton, watching her from the gate, finds himself remembering, unwillingly, the last time he saw her hold herself exactly that way. It was at Wade's funeral, standing at the graveside in a wind that would not stop, refusing every arm offered to steady her. He begins, for the first time that day, to wonder what it has cost her, these 6 years alone, to become a woman capable of standing this still in front of 200 angry neighbors while something she loves fights for its life 20 yards behind her. He thinks, unwillingly, of the last conversation he had with Wade Colton, 3 days before the heart attack that killed him. The two of them leaning against a truck bed at the feed store, while Wade rubbed absently at his own chest and joked that he'd eaten something that didn't agree with him. Merton had laughed along with him. Neither of them had thought twice about it. He wonders now, watching Bernice hold herself rigid against a fence rail 20 yards from a barn holding a dying horse, whether she has spent every day since replaying that same kind of moment, some small sign she believes she should have caught, some offhand comment she has never stopped turning over. He does not ask her. It is not the kind of question a man asks a woman in front of 200 witnesses, and some part of him understands, standing there, that it may not be a question she has ever answered even for herself. When the barn doors finally open and Grant Holbrook steps back into the daylight, his face has the particular grayness of a man who has just confirmed the worst version of something he suspected. He does not address the crowd. He walks straight to Merton, and the two men speak in voices too low for anyone else to hear, though the crowd strains forward as one body, trying to catch even a fragment of it. Whatever Grant says, it drains the color from Merton Ashby's face entirely, and when he finally turns back toward the crowd of 200 neighbors, riders, and reporters gathered along Bernice Colton's fence line, his expression carries none of the certainty it held that morning. He raises both hands for quiet, and when the crowd finally stills enough to hear him, his voice comes out rougher than anyone expected. "I need everybody to just listen a minute," he says, "before this goes any further than it already has." Merton's voice does not carry the authority of a man delivering good news. It carries the particular strain of someone about to say something that will cost him standing among people who have trusted his judgment for 30 years. "That horse's heart is failing," he says, and lets the words land before continuing. Doc Holbrook says if he'd stood in that arena this morning under full tack, under parade noise, under 4 hours of heat and crowd and flag carrying, there's a real chance he doesn't walk out of that arena alive. The silence that follows is total. Even the horses along the fence line seem to still, as if the animals themselves have caught something in the tone of the humans around them. Doreen Fitch is the first to find her voice, and what comes out of her is not concern but denial, sharp and immediate, the reflex of someone whose entire year of planning is unraveling in real time. "That's not possible," she says. "He was cleared for festival duty. The committee approved it. Doc Holbrook signed off on his fitness in March." Grant Holbrook steps forward then, and for a mild-mannered man who has spent 2 decades avoiding conflict in a town where everyone knows everyone, there is an edge in his voice that silences her immediately. "I signed off on light duty," he says. "I told this committee in writing that his joints couldn't handle a full parade season and that he needed his workload cut in half. I don't know who decided a flag-carrying appearance every single week of festival season counted as light duty, but it wasn't me." The crowd's attention turns, slow and heavy, toward Doreen and the small cluster of committee members standing near her. And for the first time since sunrise, the anger in that gathering begins to shift direction, away from the closed barn behind Bernice Colton and toward the people who built a festival schedule around an animal nobody bothered to actually examine past the paperwork. Merton turns to face the barn, and for a long moment he says nothing at all, staring at the closed doors the way a man stares at a mistake he has only just recognized as his own. "I confronted her this morning," he says, loud enough now for the whole crowd to hear, like she was the one who'd done something wrong. Like keeping that animal out of an arena that might have killed him was some kind of crime. He turns back toward Bernice, still standing on the porch, and something passes over his face that the crowd has not seen from him all day, something closer to shame than anger. "I owe you an apology," he says, and the words come out rough, unpracticed, the words of a man who has not said them often in his life. "I should have asked what you knew before I decided what you'd done." Bernice does not answer right away. Her arms are still wrapped around herself, and when she finally speaks, her voice carries a tremor she has kept out of it all morning, the first crack in 6 years of careful composure. "Nobody asked," she says. "Nobody ever asks what the quiet ones already know." Behind her, faint but audible now that the crowd has gone silent enough to hear it, comes the low, uneven sound of a horse shifting his weight inside a dim barn, alive, resting, still breathing, and the sound moves through the gathered crowd like something close to grief and something close to relief arriving in the very same breath. The crowd does not disperse quickly. It thins in stages. First, the reporters who arrived late in the morning smelling a controversy and now find themselves documenting something far more complicated than a theft. Then the riders whose horses have grown restless from standing so long. Then the committee members who slip away from Doreen Fitch's side one by one, unwilling to be seen standing too close to a decision that nearly killed the town's most beloved animal. Doreen herself remains longer than anyone, arguing in increasingly smaller circles with the handful of committee members still present, insisting that the parade can proceed without Major, that a backup horse can be found, that the schedule is sacred and must not bend. Nobody argues back with much energy. The fight has gone out of the morning, replaced by something quieter and heavier that sits over the gathered crowd like the last hour before a storm breaks. Grant Holbrook remains in the barn for nearly 2 more hours, monitoring Major's heart rate, administering fluids for the dehydration that has compounded the strain on an already weakened system, and speaking to Bernice in a low, steady voice about what the coming days will require. Complete rest. No parade appearances, not this year, not ever again if his heart is going to hold together at all. A slow tapering off the anti-inflammatory medication that has been masking the worst of his joint pain for months, replaced with something gentler, something that treats an old horse like an old horse instead of a piece of festival equipment. Bernice listens to all of it without much reaction on her face, though her hands, when Grant is not looking, tremble faintly against the stall door. Merton stays at the fence line long after the crowd has thinned to a scattered handful, unwilling, it seems, to leave until he has said something more than the apology he has already given. He finds Bernice alone near the barn's side entrance, arms still wrapped around herself, watching the last of the departing trucks kick up dust along the county road. "You knew what would happen to him," Merton says. "Not just guessed. Knew." Bernice's eyes stay fixed on the road. "I've spent 6 years learning to notice things I should have noticed sooner with somebody else," she says. "I wasn't about to make that mistake twice." Merton does not answer that right away. Something in the way she says it, flat and unadorned, tells him more about the last 6 years of her life than anything the town has ever speculated about her in his hearing. And for the first time that day, he understands that what happened this morning was never really about a horse at all. It was about a woman who once failed to hear a warning, given a second chance to hear one, and refusing, this time, to let anybody talk her out of listening. He removes his hat, an old habit from his own mother's funeral, and holds it against his chest a moment before speaking again. "The committee's going to want to make this right," he says. "However that looks. I'll make sure of it." Bernice does not respond to the offer directly. She simply nods, once, and turns back toward the barn, where the low, steady sound of Major's breathing has finally settled into something that no longer sounds like a countdown. 3 days pass before Larkspur Hollow holds its delayed festival parade, scaled back and rescheduled at Merton Ashby's insistence, without Major at its center for the first time in 11 years. A young paint gelding leads the procession instead, borrowed from a ranch 2 counties over, and the crowd that lines Main Street watches him with polite appreciation and very little of the reverence they once reserved for the horse everyone assumed would carry that flag forever. Bernice does not attend the parade. She remains at the farm, where Major has spent the last 3 days in a stall bedded deep with fresh straw, his blankets changed morning and evening, his medication reduced under Grant Hallbrook's careful supervision, his heart rate settling, day by day, into something closer to rest than the ragged strain it carried the night she found him in the ditch. It is Merton who arrives at her gate on the 4th morning, not as the head of a search party this time, but alone, on foot, carrying a folder of his own that mirrors, in an odd way, the one Doreen Fitch carried 4 days earlier with such different intent. He finds Bernice in the barn, sitting on an overturned bucket beside Major's stall, watching the old horse doze in a patch of morning light that falls through the high window she reopened for the first time in 6 years. The association held an emergency vote last night, Merton says, standing at a respectful distance from the stall door. Full board. Doreen stepped down from the festival committee, effective this morning. Grant's been asked to do full physical evaluations on every animal in festival rotation before next season. No exceptions, no politics. Bernice absorbs this without much visible reaction, though her hand, resting on the stall rail, goes still. Merton continues, quieter now. The boards also voted to retire Major from all public duty, permanent, effective today, and they voted to fund his care going forward. Feed, vet bills, whatever he needs for however many years he's got left. Bernice looks up at him then. The first time in the conversation her eyes have left the horse. Where's he going to live? She asks. And there is a wariness in the question, the old instinct of a woman who has learned not to trust good news until she understands its terms. Merton allows himself, for the first time in 4 days, something close to a smile. Here, he says, if you'll have him. The board's voting to name this barn the official Major sanctuary. Town pays for everything. You just keep doing what you did the night you found him. For a long moment, Bernice says nothing at all. Her eyes move from Merton to the horse dozing in the sunlight, and something in her face, held tightly closed for 6 long years, begins, slowly, and without her permission, to come undone. She does not sob. It is quieter than that, a single unsteady breath, a hand pressed briefly to her mouth, tears that fall without the drama the moment might have carried in a lesser telling. It is the particular, private grief of a woman finally allowing herself to feel the weight of everything she carried alone since the October morning her husband collapsed in a hay barn not unlike this one, and the particular, private relief of understanding, at last, that this time she heard the warning in time. Merton does not intrude on it. He simply stands at a respectful distance, hat in hand, and waits, the way he has learned, over 4 difficult days, to wait for this particular woman to find her own way back to speaking. The sanctuary announcement does not settle every account. Word travels back to Bernice, days later, through Merton, that a faction within the association, led quietly by Doreen Fitch's remaining allies, has raised objections to funding a private citizen's barn with town money, objections dressed in the language of budgets and precedent, but carrying, underneath, the older and more familiar resentment of watching the town's reclusive widow rewarded for what still looks, to some, like defiance rather than wisdom. Merton brings this news to Bernice not to burden her with it, but because he has learned, in the space of 1 difficult week, that she deserves better than being managed the way the town has managed her grief for 6 years, deciding on her behalf what she can and cannot handle. Let them argue it, Bernice says, when he tells her. I'm not asking the board for a thing. Major stays in this barn whether the town pays $1 toward it or not. It is Grant Hallbrook, ultimately, who tips the argument, standing before the full board and stating plainly, in the language of a man with 2 decades of professional credibility behind him, that the town very nearly killed its own symbol through negligence dressed up as tradition, and that funding his retirement is the smallest possible correction to a far larger failure. The objection dies within a single meeting, and the vote to fund the sanctuary passes without further contest. But something else lingers longer than the budget fight, something Bernice feels more than the town ever openly says. A wariness in certain faces at the feed store. a hesitation in certain waves along the county road. The particular, uneasy respect a community holds for someone who has proven herself right about something they were all, collectively, wrong about. A respect that carries within it a thread of discomfort neither side quite knows how to unravel. Bernice does not chase their approval. She has spent 6 years learning to live without it, and she finds, to her own quiet surprise, that she does not much need it now either. What she needs, and what she has, is a horse healing in her barn and a silence in her own chest that feels, for the first time since October 6 years ago, less like punishment and more like peace. Autumn comes to Larkspur Hollow the way it always has, the hills fading from gold to gray, the wind carrying the first real bite of the season down from the mountains. Major stands most days now in the small paddock beside Bernice's barn, weight settled onto all 4 legs evenly. Head high and away, it was not the night she found him collapsed at her fence line. He will never carry a flag down Main Street again. His heart, Grant Hallbrook has told her plainly, cannot be asked for anything more strenuous than the slow, unhurried life of an old horse allowed, finally, to simply be old. Bernice has found that this suits her better than the town's approval ever could. She still keeps the curtains drawn in the house some mornings, still eats most of her meals alone, still carries, and likely always will, some private measure of the guilt that sent her out into a cold October night 6 years ago too late to save the man she loved. But there is a new rhythm to her days now, built around the paddock and the barn and the particular satisfaction of watching an animal heal because someone, finally, refused to look away from what he needed. Merton visits more than he used to, ostensibly on association business, though both of them have stopped pretending that is the only reason. He brings Grant sometimes, and occasionally young Ezra, who has taken to visiting the sanctuary on his days off, standing quietly at the paddock fence the way a young man does when he is beginning to understand, for the first time, that the animals in his care are not equipment. On the 1-year anniversary of the night Major collapsed at her fence line, the association places a small plaque at the sanctuary gate, plainer than the one Doreen Fitch once planned for the grandstand, reading only a name, a set of dates, and a single line Bernice herself chose, over the objections of board members who wanted something grander. Some warnings arrive quiet. Somebody has to be listening. She stands at that gate alone the evening the plaque is installed, one hand resting on the top rail, watching Major graze in the fading light, and for the first time in 6 years, the silence she carries with her does not feel like something she failed to break in time. It feels, instead, like something she finally learned how to hear. If this story stayed with you, that's exactly what it was built to do. Somewhere out there tonight, someone is ignoring a warning sign because slowing down feels harder than pushing through, and maybe this is the story that makes them stop and listen instead. If you believe the quiet ones are usually the ones paying the closest attention, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like if Bernice earned that ending. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and stay close, because the next story we tell might be the one that hits closest to home.